Where we left off, we had just created a new scene and we put it in our folder, and then we went ahead and saved our game. When you open up Unity and you get this little window about the update check, we won't ever have to update Unity because our version is good enough. It has all the features that we will need. So if you don't want this to ever pop up again, just uncheck this check for updates. It'll no longer check for updates, and then you can go ahead and X out the window. What you should have already is the custom layout already created. So up in the top right we have your layout buttons. Right now I have my layout set to Jordan. Remember, the default when you came in kind of looked like this. What you were to do is to go through and kind of modify the windows. And so I'm going to go back to my saved layout. It's just as easy as that. So notice the little asterisk up here. Once you change something, that means the game has been changed and needs to be saved. So you can either go to File, Save Scene, or just the shortcut Control S. So next thing I'm going to show you is how to import assets. So anything from textures to scripts to objects. So all of that is under the Assets menu in the top left. We just scroll down to Import Package, and then these are all the basic packages or default packages that are included with Unity. We might get to most of them, but for right now, let's work with just the terrain assets, because this has a lot of stuff that we can do just as some practice to kind of learn how Unity works. So if we click on terrain assets, it'll decompress some of the files. It may take a minute or two, but then you'll see this window pop up. These are all the different assets. So some of these are PSD files, some of them are some materials, which we'll get into, things like that. So just leave it all selected. We want to import it all. Just click Import. And it may take a minute. It's just importing it, and you will see it as a new folder down in your resources down here in your project window. So it loads it in as standard assets. Just click this little triangle to open it up, and then you see all these subfolders. Looks like we have some grass textures, a couple of those, and notice as I click on it here in the project window, it's opened in the inspector. Okay, and these are all the different properties of the texture. You can see it's a texture type, and there's different types that you can change it to. Let's leave it as at texture. Okay, so we have all these different things. All right, when you open up these folders, you get to a folder called Materials. Any materials have this little sphere next to it. All right, and a material is basically how you apply different textures to different objects. So before we can use this, we have to have an object in our scene. So let's go ahead and add in an object so that we can add some textures to it. Okay. So the way to create objects, we have two ways. You can come up to Game Object, Create, and then you have this menu here. But the easiest way, the way that I like to do it, is just to come over to the Hierarchy window, wherever yours is. It might be in a different location, but we hit Create, and then we scroll down to whatever we want to create. We have cube, sphere, capsule, cylinder, whatever. Let's just do a cube. There we are. All right, so now put it in my scene view, but it's kind of far away. Notice it has the gizmo there that allows us to move it around. So if you click these arrows, you can change its position. If you ever change something and you don't like the way it looks, just like in Word or any other program, Control-Z just moves it back. Right, if we want to zoom in on this, it's kind of far away. So I'm going to click on it, and while my cursor is over the scene view, I'm going to hit the F key. If I try and hit the F key when my cursor is not over the window, nothing's going to happen. So your cursor needs to be over the scene view. We know it's the scene view because it says that at the tab. And then hit F and it zooms in on it. Okay. To help zoom around and rotate the camera, remember you can hold Alt and then left mouse button drags around, or you can just drag the right mouse button rather. Right? So those are your two ways to rotate the camera. Alright, so I'll zoom out a little bit. Alright, so let's talk about some of the properties that this object has. Okay, now we have two objects in our scene. We have the main camera, and we have the cube. When I click on the cube, notice that it changes in the inspector, And then each one of these little boxes here is actually called a component. And then each component has properties. So this cube specifically has a transform component, a mesh filter component, a box collider, so that if this box were to collide with anything else, we can set this to be a trigger, which would trigger some type of event. And then we have a mesh renderer. This is where the textures will go. And then this is the default texture that the cube has. It always has this white type of texture. So it's kind of bland right now. It's just sitting there, not very fun. So let's go ahead and add a texture to it. So make sure you have the cube selected, either from the hierarchy menu or clicking in the scene. And let's go ahead and change the material here. So to change the material, we want to keep it all organized in our assets folder. So let's create a new folder in our assets. So if you click on assets, right click, create folder. So just like we did with the scenes, we're going to create a new folder, and let's call this materials. In this materials folder, let's go ahead and select, and it says it's empty, but that's because we just created it. So now we're going to right click, create. We're going to create a new material to put on our cube. So if we click that, it's asking for a name for our material. I'm just going to call it grass. Pretty plain. All right. Notice that the default material is also white, just like the cube, but we can change that. If you come up here and click on in the inspector on the material, it actually opens up. So you see a few different things. If you ever need to edit the component that's in the inspector, it usually has some options by this little gear here. It also has a shader. This is the way that the texture is displayed via the light map in the game. So we have, for example, some shaders that can reflect light. It can inverse the picture. It can send off reflections that we see in the game, things like that. All right now, let's just leave it on diffuse. Okay? And it's asking for a texture. There is no texture. It's perfectly white. So what we need to do is add a texture here. So there's a few different ways to do that. What I'm going to do is open up my standards asset and go to where my grass images were. So these ones are weeds. We don't want those. We want to look for, here it is, my grass. Looks like a repeating background. Remember, you can drag these windows and resize them any way you want. Anywhere you see a border, you can drag. So this is kind of small. It's hard for me to see. So I'm going to grab, whoops, didn't mean to minimize it. Grab this preview window. I'm going to bring it up, make it a little bit bigger so I can see it. So this is a nice repeating texture. So what we're going to do is go ahead and add this to our cube. So we need to go back to our grass material. So we click on our materials folder, grass. In our terrain textures, I'm going to click this grass texture and move it over into the texture. Okay. Notice it changed the grass, it changed the picture. This is now displaying, even though it looks like a sphere here, this is just so you can get a view of what the material looks like, or the texture looks like. And notice you can click and drag, move that all over just to see what it's going to look like on a sphere. You can even change what the preview is by clicking this, and this is pretty much what it's going to look like. It's going to look like a cube. Click on that, goes to a cylinder, goes to a donut, kind of a nasty looking donut. Click on that, goes back to a sphere. So those are your different preview options. Alright, so we have this new material now. Okay, if you click somewhere else, it kind of disappears from the inspector, but don't worry, it's always in your assets folder. Just click on that material again, you have it back. Alright, to actually add it to the cube, it's pretty simple. You can either click on the cube, click and drag this over into the material, or you can even click and drag it into the object in the scene view. Right, when I release it on here, notice it overwrites the material that's already there, and our cube now has a grass looking texture to it. All right, it looks a little bit like Minecraft. You can experiment with that for a little bit. I challenge you to create one or two more materials, maybe add one for this dirt texture that we have, maybe one for the cliff, and see if you can do that. Remember to keep them all together. We want to keep them in the materials folder.